Can you feel the heat? Say hello to Eddie. I don't care if you don't like me. Fight me. Do you feel it? Hey, beat on me. Yo.
Hello and welcome to the Podski. I'm your host, Johnny Bake Show, and ringside with me is Teddy Mongoose. It is the bonus Eddie Guerrero episode. You guys, the subscribers, unlocked this when we hit 500 subscribers, so we thank you for subscribing. We also have the Scott Hall episode coming up as well. That is another bonus show because we surpassed 750 subscribers, and we are very close to the Macho Man Randy Savage when we hit 1,000 subscribers. So if you want to support the channel, the best way to do that is by subscribing, and we very much thank all of you for listening and tuning in. This one is going to be a fun one because I love Eddie Guerrero so much, and we're going to kick things off here. This Guerrero family legacy started with his father, Salvatore Gory Guerrero, who got his name because of the bloodbath matches he was in regularly. His dad debuted in Arena, Mexico at 17 years old, and he went to work with Luthez, who would often give Gory a lot of praise. Main events in Texas with Dory Funk Sr. as well. He also teamed with El Santo, who ended up being one of the largest cultural icons in Mexican wrestling history. Gory settled his family in El Paso, Texas, where he wound down his wrestling career and began his promoting career. He had some financial backers early and successfully ran for about 2-ish years. And after the backers pulled out, he had little money and no jobs. So he went back on the road and soon was NWA World Light Heavyweight Champion. He saved his money and in 1961 made a deal with Channel 13 in El Paso to broadcast weekly wrestling. And he began running every Monday night at the City Coliseum.
So the Monday is notable because Eduardo Eddie Guerrero was born on October 9th, 1967. His mother was alone in an El Paso hospital because Eddie, the last of 6 children, came on a Monday, which was wrestling night in El Paso City Coliseum. Thus, the whole family was working. As John said, Gory was the local promoter. His sons, Salvatore Jr., a.k.a. Chavo Classic, Armando, who we will know as Mondo moving forward, and Hector, yes, the gobbledygooker, did everything from $13 on ringside right now.
Yes.
Did everything from set up chairs to work the front door to hang out in the dressing rooms to run finishes and high spots back and forth from the babyface to the heel dressing rooms. Just like those in attendance, most of the family's introduction to Eddie, who had not been named yet, came about 20 minutes after his birth when, and dude, how epic is this? The ring announcer on the loudspeaker says, "Ladies and gentlemen, we are proud to announce that Mr. and Mrs. Gory Guerrero have just become the parents of a baby boy."
That is incredible. There's no better way to be introduced into the world.
Unreal, dude. So his brother Mondo said when he came into this world, it was a big announcement at a wrestling show, and he left the same way. And that is horribly sad.
That is, yes. Wow. Oh my.
With Dory Jr. mostly on tour as world champion, Terry Funk would have headlined most Monday nights in El Paso. He remembered Eddie when he was still in diapers. And Terry Funk recalled, quote, "They were very acrobatic kids. I remember all the kids back then. Eddie was always in the office in diapers," end quote. And what else might have Terry said here, John?
Your mother's a whore.
All right, brother, let's break. And would you please take us through Eddie's title history?
Eddie's title history is a long one, and it begins with the World Wrestling Alliance Trios belts. He was a one-time champion alongside with Chavo Classic and Mondo Guerrero in 1989. He was the Latin American Heavyweight Champion one time in 1990. In 1991 and 92, he was the World Wrestling Alliance Welterweight Champion. I don't think I've ever heard of a welterweight championship in professional wrestling.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know, man. This
That's
was
really
a new one on me. Yeah.
In 1994, he was teaming with Art Barr, the Love Machine, in AAA and IWC, and they were the World Tag Team Champions there. In ECW, he was a two-time champion, defeating Too Cold Scorpio in 1995 and then Dean Malenko in 1995. He was a two-time champion. He defeated Too Cold Scorpio in April of 95, and a few months later in July, he beats Dean Malenko. He was the WCW United States Heavyweight Champion. He defeated DDP in a tournament final for the vacant title in December of 96. He was a two-time Cruiserweight Champion. He defeated Alex Wright and Rey Mysterio in late 97, which we'll talk about that match coming up here. In WWE, he was a European champion two times. He defeated Chris Jericho in April of 2000, and then he defeated Test in April of 2001. He was WWE SmackDown Tag Team Champion four times. He did that two times with Chavo Jr., one time with Tajiri, and one time with Rey Mysterio. And I'm going to be honest, I don't remember him being tag team champions with Tajiri. I want to go back and watch that now. That has to be electric.
Well, yeah, and we'll go through this actually later on. Tajiri is initially brought up as a sub for an injured Chavo. Yeah. So that was the genesis of that idea anyways.
Gotcha. He was WWE Intercontinental Champion two times. He defeated China in the triple threat with Kurt Angle in September of 2000. And then he defeated RVD in April of 2002. He was U.S. Heavyweight Champion in WWE one time, defeating Chris Benoit in the tournament final in July of 2003. His final singles title that he won was the WWE Championship, and he defeated Brock Lesnar in February of 2004.
Okay, so to go back into the timeline, Gory brought wrestling into his son's life as a sport, but didn't want them following in his footsteps. He demanded they all graduated college, and he wanted them to have regular lives with jobs, families, etc., and just wrestle on the side. So the three older brothers, Chavo Classic, Mondo, and Hector, wrestled as La Familia Guerreros, first in Ciudad Juarez, and became the Wrestling Guerreros when based out of Los Angeles after the weekly wrestling operation was closed in the mid-70s. All of Gory's children, but Mondo and Eddie, ended up graduating college. They actually had a ring in their backyard, and all of the boys were taught shooting and later on working. When Gory had his sons practice wrestling matches in front of him, they had to shoot for 20 minutes before they were ever allowed to work. His mentality was to continually do drills so that they would have perfect, real wrestling technique. Mondo said, "We trained until we dropped, and you would have to learn all of your working moves to have authenticity." Eddie learned the same way. Eddie was raised very differently than his brothers. By the time he had come around, his parents were much older. His sister Cookie, Chavo, and Mondo were old enough to be his parents and would often treat him more like a son than a younger brother, even when he was grown. Eddie's relationship with Gory was different than his older brothers, as his dad was home to spend more time with him. He would take him to events, games, and then he would even sit with his dad as his dad did the announcing for the weekly TV wrestling in Ciudad Juarez. So, John, let's break for a second. Let's go back to some career accolades.
We will start in 1996 with the Super Juniors. He went under the name of Black Tiger and won the B block and pinned Jushin Liger to win the finals. In the Wrestling Observer newsletter, Eddie's accolades start in 1994. He gets two in that year. He gets Feud of the Year with his tag team partner Love Machine versus the AAA Babyfaces, and they get Tag Team of the Year as well. In 1995, he gets Feud of the Year with his feud against Dean Malenko. In 2002, he wins Tag Team of the Year with his nephew Chavo Jr., and in 2004, he won Most Charismatic Wrestler.
All right, so we go back into our Eddie timeline. So we're now in the high school years. So by the time Eddie was in high school, his father's wrestling and promoting days were over. His brothers were wrestling all over the world. They wrestled at times in Mexico, all over the U.S., as well as Japan. His father retired from the wrestling industry, and they lived as a middle class or even perhaps lower middle class family. And during some summer vacations in high school, he would be sent to live with Chavo in Los Angeles, where he and Chavo Jr. lived like brothers. And I thought that was a really cool little layer there, that his nephew Chavo, they were actually literally sort of, raised like brothers. It's pretty cool.
That is really cool.
In high school, he always kept his family's wrestling history to himself. His best friend actually had to be the one to ask him if he was related to Chavo Classic after seeing Chavo Classic on wrestling tapes. And Eddie just replied, yeah, that's my brother.
That's so great.
That same friend then said, quote, we were always watching pro wrestling, but we never talked about becoming pro wrestlers, end quote. Eddie's obsessive behavior actually started to become noticeable in high school. He was always lifting weights. He wanted to get bigger. Mondo told him to eat 18 eggs a day as protein powder, creatine, supplements. That wasn't really a thing yet. Soon, he was eating 18 eggs in a sitting more than once a day.
Oh my gosh. The cholesterol's got to be through the roof.
Could you imagine what the plate looked like, John?
Just 18 yolks just hanging out there.
His mother got worried and asked about him being healthy, and Mondo told her, quote, that's just what wrestlers do, end quote. This was an interesting little nugget here. So Mondo got a copy of the Underground Steroid Handbook. And I only bring this up because I actually heard about this from the internet when I was in high school, from the gyms that I went to and stuff. So this was a real thing, and it was a thing before the internet was a thing. Do you know what I mean? It was literally a pamphlet that would go around. And so Mondo says that he sent Eddie a copy. Mondo got his in Oregon in 1983. And he was quite open about his guilt that basically that may have started him on the path that probably led to his death later on. His dad didn't believe in weightlifting, though. So Eddie's obsessive. Eddie's trying to get bigger. The boys are on the road. Obviously, they are being enlightened to what is going on with the gas and everything else. And Gory doesn't even believe in lifting. He thinks that you get big from wrestling and eating a lot.
I love that. That makes so much sense to the old time wrestlers.
It really does. So even though Eddie would have easy access traveling to Mexico, Conan believes Eddie started with steroids after they talked about it in and around 1991 or 1992. Again, only saying that because obviously with how he passes later on, this was going to be a related cause. And so we are looking at probably a 15-ish, 14-ish year foray with the gas, among other things that we'll get into. So Eddie really got his first taste of pro wrestling lifestyle during a summer vacation in 1984. Eddie and Chavo Jr. spent most of the summer in Florida, where Chavo Sr. and Hector held the U.S. tag titles. They went on the road and lived like wrestlers did, Mondo said. They lived in hotels and dressing rooms. They heard all the stories about the nasty things that wrestlers did with women and all the drugs. And he didn't look at it like it was bad. It was just the wrestler's life. So he was not turned off in the same way that, perhaps an Owen Hart or somebody that we had chronicled previously might have been. Eddie was the city champion in amateur wrestling in 1984 and 1985. He placed in state in both years. And while all of his bios claim a wrestling scholarship to New Mexico State, his high school best friend said that it was really to New Mexico Hastings. And Eddie only lasted a semester until he decided that he wanted to be a pro wrestler. So, John, that is where we are. Eddie has jumped out of school and said, I'm going to make it in this business. Would you please take us into the early work?
He had talked his father into setting up the ring again and teaching him and his two friends. One was still active in El Paso in 2005, and the other played Eddie's bodyguard in a WCW LWO segment in WCW.
Pretty cool that he
brought him along.
Right.
His father was a demanding trainer. He did the same drills he did with his older brothers, with some new twists sprinkled in this time. One of the drills was learning how to throw a working punch. He did the same drills that he did with his older brothers with some new twists sprinkled in now. One of the drills was learning how to throw a working punch. He would make Eddie punch the wall and tell him, if you hurt your hand, that means you're hurting your opponent. But if you don't feel your hand hit the wall, it means you aren't connecting. And we've heard this before throughout wrestling with Ric Flair like punching the string hanging from the door frame, Steve Austin punching the towel. These are, except only like they're hitting very soft objects, and Eddie's literally punching a wall.
Yeah, dude. And you know what? I guess the wall would be a way better teacher than a towel or a string would.
Mm-hmm.
Being honest, I would hate the learning curve.
The learning curve would be so hard. I know that like Flair, he explained it as he tried to punch it and not have that string move at all.
Right. And that was what, yep. And that was the same thing with Austin. The towel hit the towel, but the towel doesn't move at all. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really good. That's so interesting. He told him you had to feel a little bit of pain when you threw a punch or else it wouldn't look convincing. When Eddie's friends weren't around, he would literally give Eddie a broom and tell him to work a convincing 2-minute match and put the broom over, which that's actually really funny because that's how they made Bischoff. That's how Vince made Bischoff audition, was to sell him on the broom.
Mm-hmm.
Then he would tell him to work another 2 minutes and have the broom put him over. That's crazy.
And dude, it's the insane thing about this was there was, they would always say that Ric Flair could work with a broom, the dumping, and we'll get to Scott Hall whenever we cover Scott next. But, they had said that Shawn Michaels wrestled a ladder in the Mania 10 match. He literally made his son wrestle a broom.
Yes. He probably wrestled a broom 150 times.
It's nuts, man.
Man. Eddie debuted in Ciudad Juarez in the summer of 1987. The first story is that he wrestled under the name Mascara Mexica, so he wouldn't have the pressure of the family name in his first match. And the second story comes from Conan, his high school best friend, and Mondo. And they all say that he started as Eduardo Guerrero, and his first year was really tough. The local promoters wanted to start him as Gory Guerrero Jr. since Gory was his real middle name. He didn't want to do it, and his father eventually squashed the idea, knowing that he was going to have a hard time just with the last name alone. He was a natural in the ring, but because of who he was and how much talent he had, a lot of the vets took liberties with him early, which is what we know a lot of in pro wrestling history.
Gotta break him in.
He quickly became a big star, and within a few months, he started working in the same arena as Conan. Conan was strictly a body guy and with not a lot of respect for the business. Eddie, being the opposite, invited Conan to his home. After meeting Gory, Conan's outlook started to change, and he began reading books on wrestling, and these are all from Gory's library of wrestling books, and started working with Eddie, and they caught lightning in a bottle.
It's just crazy to think of Conan as not being this like master manipulator, wrestling politician, business guy. And I should plug here that our reference material for this came from the December 5th Wrestling Observer newsletter, the Life and Times of Eddie Guerrero. And to think that Conan is strictly just this essentially body guy oaf and not this master manipulator is completely insane, man. And there you go. The Guerreros. And I maybe that's why, he held Eddie in such high regard and, things went the way that they did. But we'll see here that, this is a bond that is going to be forged in fire, man.
And Conan said that they did monster business. We had 13 straight sellouts. And in the arena where they did this, it held 6,000 fans. He goes on to say, first, me and Eddie were a team. And then I turned on him and we feuded, end quote.
So that'll take us into his first big moments in the ring. So on September 18th, 1987, he made his Arena Mexico debut for the 54th anniversary show before 12,860 fans. Chavo, Mondo, and Hector teamed up in one match, and he debuted in an undercard match, teaming with El Hijo del Santo. His father was used as a promotion for the event as well, so they got the whole Guerrero gang here for the anniversary show. He was already getting a reputation throughout Mexico as being the one who was going to be the best of the Guerreros, which was incredible pressure to put on a 19-year-old. And Dave Meltzer writes that there are a number of parallels between Eddie Guerrero and Owen Hart. So these are Dave's words. Both were the son of legends. Both had wrestling rings on their property. Their fathers were shooters. Their older brothers were wrestlers with varying degrees of success. Both wrestled amateur. Both were naturally shy. Both were naturals and were stars from the moment they stepped into the ring, and were resented by the wrestlers in the area because it was so obvious they were going places. Both were also considered too small to headline in the US, but went internationally to make themselves a name. The big difference is that Hart never put the kind of pressure on himself that Guerrero did, and he didn't have the addictive personality. How about those parallels, man?
They literally walked step through step, basically in different eras together. Yeah. It's crazy.
Yeah, it is. And then they obviously both passed away entirely too young, which is another, right, terrible thing. So Terry Funk sees a tape of Eddie Guerrero wrestling from Arena, Mexico, where he, Chavo, and Mondo were teaming together. Funk brings him to WCW, where a skinny Eddie Guerrero worked a TV match, taking a beat down from Funk, who was prepping for his program with Flair. Check the page for the Flair promo on that.
Yes. Sure, it's there.
Eddie's standout moment was a plancha, which, dude, this is 1989, okay? So he does a plancha, which was a move that was hardly seen on U.S. television at that time. Funk said that his performance really turned some heads, and he said that Eddie reminded him of Muda. Funk said, quote, "I didn't even want to beat him, but I wanted to get the right people to see him. He looked great. After the match, they never even talked about him again. What can you do?" End quote. And what else did Terry probably say?
Your mother's a whore.
Before the match, Funk was telling people in the locker room he'll be the greatest Guerrero ever. Paul Heyman was there and claimed that he knew from that day that he'd be a star just from his presence in the locker room, and was sold on him for good after seeing him work the match. Around that time, on a blind date, Eddie met Vicky Lara, a cheerleader for the El Paso Diablos, a local minor league baseball team. However, this was a bittersweet period in his life as his father was dying from cancer. So Gory Guerrero died on April 18th, 1990 at the age of 69. As he was dying, he ordered that Eddie, no matter what happened, was not to cancel his wedding to Vicky. He was buried on April 21st. That night, Eddie and his two friends, one of them being Conan, went out for what was supposed to be a bachelor party. It basically ended up being Conan just driving around El Paso while the other two got drunk and screamed out of the car window. Eddie was married the next day, and a day later, all of the brothers wrestled on a memorial show for their father. And Mondo quotes here, "It was just like watching Raw the day after Eddie's death. The crowd kept chanting, 'Gory, Gory.'" And this is so sad.
Man, it is. It's really crazy how this all happened. Man.
John, we are in 1990. Like, that's what's wild about this Eddie story, is that not only for the sake of time, right? Like, we weren't able to go through every nook and cranny, but you have all these synchronicities and things that are going on, and we're in 1990. To hop back in, we are going to go overseas. His first major break came in April of 92. New Japan was looking for another wrestler from Mexico for that year's Top of the Super Juniors. That later becomes known and is now known as the Best of the Super Juniors tournament. He was recommended by Negro Casa and was mainly just there to job. He finished in 5th place, and his only wins were over bottom guys. He wrestled and lost to Pegasus Kid, who was Chris Benoit, in the tournament. And it should be noted that he was already friends with Benoit. They met in 1990 when Benoit was working in Mexico. And John, you have a story about this, right?
I do. Benoit actually told a story of their first ever match with some who thought that it was the best match of the tournament. Benoit accidentally knocked Guerrero out, and with Guerrero groggy, Benoit called for a high spot, and Guerrero didn't actually acknowledge it. Benoit tried again, and he didn't get an answer, so Benoit called to send the match home early, and Guerrero did the entire finishing sequence perfectly, just as they laid it out. When Guerrero found out what happened, he apologized for him for getting knocked out, so the match didn't go perfectly. and Benoit was stunned that the guy that he knocked out was apologizing to him.
Wild, man.
I know.
Yeah. So in early 1993, New Japan management felt that the Jushin Thunder Liger versus Pegasus program had run its course, especially after Liger unmasked Pegasus in a mask versus mask match. This is where I believe he turns from Pegasus Kid to Wild Pegasus without the mask on. Looking for a new masked wrestler to be Liger's rival, they came up with the idea to recreate Black Tiger, which was a cartoon character from the Tiger Mask cartoon. Eddie was suggested for the role, but because of his physical size, was initially passed over. And this brings to mind the original Big Van Vader deal. Are you familiar?
No.
The original Big Van Vader was actually cast and sold to Jim Hellwig.
Really?
Yes. He then went on to sign with WWF, and Leon White was signed. He beat Inoki right away, and then he ruled the world for a couple of years. But Jim Hellwig was the initial idea for the Big Van Vader character.
I had no idea.
Love it, man.
That's so cool.
We drop him here on the Podski, baby boy.
We really do.
So the 1993 Top of the Super Junior tournament was Eddie's third tour. Because of how impressive he was in his first two, he was now being pushed heavily. He ended up tied for second place, losing to Malenko, who he had beaten in the tournament, in a playoff match for the final. And if you don't know, these are round robin tournaments. That's how that's able to happen. He debuted as Black Tiger in late September 1993 and went on a win streak before he faced Liger, Jushin Thunder Liger, just to be clear, for the IWGP Junior title, a match that he lost. By this time, he was working for AAA as well and was making enough money to buy a home in El Paso. He would do 17 Japan tours over the next 5 years, working mainly in the middle of the card, but having banger matches with his opponents. In October 1994, Black Tiger teamed with Great Sasake, losing to Pagasus and Ohtani in what Dave Meltzer called a match of the year candidate. I tried to find this on New Japan World. I couldn't. I don't know if it might be somewhere on YouTube. I did not check YouTube. I was just in a New Japan World, but I got to check that one out. The junior tag team tournament, which that match was a part of, actually outdrew the heavyweight tag tournament that year. And that was something that he was very proud of. The next year, he tied for first in the best of the Super Junior tournaments, but lost to Pegasus in the playoff. However, in 1996, he won his block outright and pinned Pegasus before a sellout crowd in Hiroshima to make the finals. In another sellout, in the main event, he faced Jushin Thunder Liger for the tournament championship, which is our first match highlight. John, I pass the ball to you.
Our first match highlight came to us June 12th, 1996, the Best of Super Juniors final. It is Black Tiger versus Jushin Thunder Liger. Our match starts with Jushin wanting a handshake and Tiger shrugs him off. There might be nothing better than when they start with a handshake, just a nice firm one right in the middle of the ring.
That is one thing that one of the good things about the rehash of Ring of Honor is that the honor code was returned, where they did have to start everyone with the shake.
Might be the only good thing they brought back.
You might be right.
They trade holds with some lucha mixed in early by Tiger. Wild Pegasus is watching from ringside. Tiger gets Jushin in a camel clutch, but Liger breaks the hold. Now into a test of strength, which Tiger somehow turns into a Hurricane Rana. And brother, you know me, there's nothing better than a test of strength. I know that this is one of your matches that you brought here for us. I need to understand how they turned a test of strength into a Hurricane Rana. It is like
Eddie levitated into the air. It was incredible, dude. It was such an incredible high spot, man. Yeah, it was awesome.
Tiger works over Jushin's leg and then puts him in a figure four. Jushin escapes, puts Black Tiger into a surfboard, and then works a camel clutch of his own. Jushin starts to work Tiger's arm, and Black Tiger cuts him off, grounds him, and hits a vintage Eddie Top Road assisted senton from the apron onto Jushin. Jushin is working the arm again, and after a brief Tiger comeback, punches him off the top rope to the outside, climbs to the top, and hits him with a huge crossbody to the floor. Back in the ring, Jushin hits a cradle, or Jushin gets a cradle with another near fall. Both guys trade near falls, and Jushin does a German that nearly threw Black Tiger back to El Paso.
Jushin, what would you say? He yeeted him.
He yeeted him. Jushin hits a huge Liger bomb, and Tiger kicks out. The crowd was all the way up for this near fall. Tiger hits a brain buster and a razor's edge set up into a power bomb. And we have looked all over the place to figure this out. Please let us know in the comments, because we're unsure, but we think that this is what the BT bomb is. So if you know, please let us know in the comments below. But Jushin kicks out after that. The finish had Black Tiger hitting a top rope brainbuster on Jushin for the pin. Black Tiger became your 1996 Best of the Super Juniors tournament champion.
Okay, so we are going back in time and back across the Pacific for his breakout in Mexico. So we've reached the peak in Japan, so now let's see the rise in Mexico. So in 1991, he worked Arena Mexico, mostly in the middle of the card during a period when, due to wrestling being broadcast for the first time in decades in Mexico City, business was booming. They were topping 10,000 plus every Friday night and 6,000 to 8,000 every Sunday. That is insane, man.
That is really insane.
Same arena, just 18-ish thousand people a weekend is nuts. So Bake, could you please give us some background as to what is now happening behind the scenes in Mexico? And just so everybody knows, Arena Mexico is EMLL, which then becomes CMLL. And we have another company starting. So take us through that.
In 1992, Antonio Pena was the booker and the brainchild of the characters and all of the programs that they were created during the boom. He and Conan broke off of CMLL to create their own company, AAA. And if you want to know more why there is so much beef between the two companies even now, this is why. They quickly signed up 3 of CMLL's 5 biggest draws at the time: Santo, Octagon, and Paraguayo. They would later find and sign Rey Mysterio Jr. and Psychosis.
So that is, as John said, the reason why this guy can't work on Forbidden Door. This guy can't work on this TV show. The beef is still real, brother. And Conan is still AAA and CMLL is still a deal. And for the contemporary layer to this, currently CMLL has a strong working relationship with AEW and AAA is working with WWE. So EMLL, again, as it was called at the time, was desperate to create new stars and give Eddie a mask and the name Mascara Mágica. He worked a major program with Ultimo Dragon that year, and although his star was rising, he hated the gimmick. He lived in a hotel in Mexico City that all the Americans stayed at, and he really hit it off with Love Machine Art Bar. Chris Jericho would actually stay at that same hotel later on. Eddie and Machine tried bringing their families to Mexico City, but the living conditions were much worse than the U.S., and their families hated it. So Conan, on the side, was recruiting Eddie hard to join him in AAA. Eddie was torn because his family's been with EMLL literally forever, like decades and decades.
Mm-hmm.
He was finally swayed when Conan got him a $2,000 per week guarantee, and his exit from EMLL was big news. After a match in Arena Mexico, he breaks custom and tradition and voluntarily pulls the Mascara Mágica mask off of his head in the ring and says, "I'm Eddie Guerrero, son of Gory Guerrero, and I don't need to be wrestling under a mask." End scene.
I literally had no idea this was the thing. That breaks the entire tradition of Mexican wrestling.
And
he literally broke the wheel.
Dude, he lit it all on. He was the Joker in the nurse's outfit walking away from the hospital exploding.
Wow, he literally burned the town down.
He absolutely did. So he's now in AAA, and his tag team with Love Machine is formed over a couple of stages. The gist of it is, 4 years before Stone Cold and Bret, Love Machine became heel because he was an undersized, always used babyface in a famous double turn with Blue Panther. And Dave Meltzer explains, basically saying, like, there's no way that Stone Cold and Bret were watching this at that time. But there are like parallels into the story as to how they got one over as a babyface and one over a heel over the program. So after this, Guerrero Machine, which Eddie is a heel, Guerrero Machine become a team when they turn on El Hijo del Santo in a trios match. The two debut as Los Gringos Locos in front of 10,000 fans in August 1993, and they wore glorious matching outfits, spoof like 1980s American baby faces, clapping, USA, USA. Machine was the one that had the charisma, and Eddie was the one that did the work. Mm-hmm. So that was the dynamic of their team. The team changed the promotion's work style. Machine would play American heel, working the crowd and with his selling, and Guerrero brought Japanese-style suplexes and physicality. So this was a really new thing in Lucha Town, right? Like this is an exciting layer that comes in. This was actually one of the things that allowed several AAA wrestlers to transition easier to the US and Japanese markets. So being able to do more than just Lucha made them a much more translatable character. Kone was even quoted saying, quote, they brought in American selling, they took flat back bumps that Mexicans didn't know how to take, and more, end quote. Their main program through 1994 was with Santo and Octagon. AAA works out a deal with WCW to produce their first ever pay-per-view show in November called When Worlds Collide, and the two tag teams were part of a double main event in a double mask versus double hair match. John, second match highlight. I'm tossing it to you.
Yes, this was November 6th, 1994, as you mentioned. AAA When Worlds Collide. Eddie Guerrero and Love Machine versus Octagon and El Hijo del Santo. And Mike Tenay is on the call. And fun fact, this is the first ever show that he called, which I actually didn't know that coming into this. And because when I watched it, I was like, that's Tenay. Where'd he come from? Like, this is early.
The backstory is that like people didn't want to do it. And he lied and said, I can do it. Like I have announcing experience. And they said, okay, sure. And he was this huge fan that was this total like history book. He was an encyclopedia, man. And that was what he did all through WCW. And so, yes, this was literally the first match he ever called.
This is how
the first show he ever called, I should say.
I feel like that's how we're going to get into the business. We're just going to do it one day.
Lie on a resume to the moon.
Guerrero and Love Machine are in the stars and bars. And like you said, this look is amazing. The fans start to chant, Mexico, Mexico. And Eddie and Machine bail to start and walk down the aisle. The crowd is nuclear. And I feel like I'm going to say that 100 times throughout this review because this crowd was electric, nuclear, all of the adjectives that describe like how much that they were into this is literally insane. It is on YouTube. The link will be in the description below. They go crazy. Let us know what you think about this match in the comments.
And the other insane thing is this is in LA. This isn't in Mexico.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, yes. And I wanted to bring that up because this is known as one of the greatest tag team matches in Mexico, and it happens in LA. But the whole crowd, dude, is Mexico, like just like you, and they're just doing a USA, the hacksaw Jim Duggan deal, like all that. Yeah, it's excellent stuff.
And like we mentioned, it is a double mask, double hair with a 2 out of 3 falls. There's a lot of stakes on the line here. So Eddie and Santo start out, and this is an awesome mix of chain wrestling with some real flair. Machine asks for a handshake and immediately kicks Octagon low when he extends his hand and he goes to work on him. Octagon is dumped outside. Machine puts Santo on his shoulders, and Eddie hits a Hurricane Rana on Santo while he's in the electric chair. And
incredible spot.
It really was really good. And the first pin goes to the heels. They pull in Octagon and immediately go for the power and glory spot. Eddie hits the superplex and Love Machine hits the frog splash. Cocky cover, 3 count, and the heels win the first fall. Next fall, Eddie works over Santo with suplexes and covers. Octagon and Machine tag in, and they are getting the heat on El Santo in the corner. And there are some classic Eddie spots here, and we're only 9 minutes into the match.
7,000 things happen in those first 9 minutes, dude.
Yeah, that was one thing I know. Like, while I was watching it, I was like, I feel like I've seen so much, and I looked down, and it literally said 9 minutes.
Yeah, crazy.
Santo runs in, backdrops Eddie, and makes an awesome comeback with stereo drop kicks and some tope suicidas. They come back inside, and Eddie hits a Hurricane Rana off the top rope to pin Santo. They still need to pin Octagon to win this. Octagon pins Eddie with a roll-up and immediately puts Machine into a submission hold, and we're tied at 1 fall apiece.
Really, really cool how this is booked, because in order to win a fall, you have to pin both members of the team, and when one person's pinned or submitted, they're eliminated. So they have these baby faces in the most baby face spot.
Yes.
Quickly lose. Oh, we're down 1 fall. Both get, wiped out in the first couple of minutes. 0-2. Second fall, right away, we have another pin, and now it's just Octagon versus 2. And he beats them both. So they literally were technically down. It's 1st to 4, and they were down 3-0.
It's insane.
Yeah.
And that's actually incredible babyface booking for them.
Yes.
To really put them over. Our final fall is a quick near fall on Eddie by Santo. Eddie puts Santo into a camel clutch, and Octagon kicks his head off. Santo does the clutch, and Machine kicks his head off. Octagon rocks Machine with kicks. Santo starts working over Eddie. Machine and Eddie turn the tables, hit a double tope suicida of their own. Santo hits Eddie with a sunset flip bomb to the floor.
So because Eddie hits that sunset flip bomb onto the floor, the referee's back is turned.
Oh.
So he's looking at the guys that are on the floor, which allows Love Machine to get the spinning tombstone, an illegal move on Octagon while the referee's back's turned. He pins him, and they literally stretcher job out Octagon. So now it's babyface versus 2 heels, and you just stretcher jobbed one of the baby faces with an illegal move. Nuclear.
Yes, the crowd they're exploding for this. We get the power and glory spot again, but Santo kicks out. Santo does a dive to the outside on Eddie. Blue Panther runs in and hits a pile driver on Machine while the ref's back is turned, and Santo runs in for the pin. It's Eddie versus Santo for the final fall. Eddie hits a top rope belly to belly and a top rope Hurricane Rana for near falls. Eddie goes for a full Nelson. Santo slips out, rolls up Eddie, and gets the 3 count. There is so much going on here in this match, but the crowd is, if you could say, like, this is an actual representation of the crowd blowing the roof off the building.
Oh yeah, dude. And again, I'm not very well versed in, AAA, CMLL, et cetera, beyond like some of the big names, but Blue Panther, his run in there was another huge deal, because if you recall in the build up to this, he was part of the initial turn with Love Machine. So he gets comeuppance on Machine. Crowd goes nuts for that. He hits his own illegal maneuver, and we get the penalty. And then the boys got their heads shaved. Yeah. So it was awesome. So Dave Meltzer said that for the rest of his life, when asked about what his best bouts were in his career, this was always one of the 3 matches that Eddie would bring up. Paul Heyman now enters the chat. He first tried to use Eddie when producing a television pilot for Jim Crockett in Austin, Texas in the summer of 1993, but Eddie couldn't do it because of a booking conflict. Just before the Worlds Collide show, Heyman called Love Machine about bringing the team to ECW to work a program with Public Enemy. On November 23rd, a shade over 2 weeks after the Worlds Collide show, Art Barr and his son went to sleep in the afternoon, and Art never woke up. He was 28 years old. So that was actually Art's last match, that tag match.
Wow, I did not know that. That is so incredibly sad.
Yes. And even worse is that I read through what was reported, and like the coroner basically said they think that it was bad Mexican pain pills and alcohol. But like, it was just very strange. You know what I mean? A few days later, due to the state of Mexico's economy. So what happened here is the peso is being heavily devalued and Eddie's being paid in US dollars. So because the peso is so devalued compared to the dollar, Eddie is needing to be paid like 10 times what everybody else is. And the company told him that they could no longer afford him and he was let go. So another whirlwind of tragedy that Eddie loses his tag team partner and one of his best friends, and then loses one of his jobs, almost back to back.
It feels like how many times we have to see like tragedy throughout Eddie's life, and like it just feels like it's just starting.
And he's a resilient fellow, man, but you wonder where some of these demons and things come from, right? Like,
right.
I hate to say it, but that's, people self-medicate or do whatever, and it's a shame. So we are now in the ECW time frame. So Benoit and Malenko both pushed Heyman to bring Eddie to ECW. Upon doing so, Heyman's idea was to put the TV title on him right away, beating Too Cold Scorpio and dedicating the win to Art Barr.
And this is actually where Eddie started using the frog splash as his finisher as a tribute to Barr.
Really cool, dude.
It is really cool. I had no idea about that until I read that.
Yep, and especially in seeing seeing that tag match, because Barr, Eddie did the suplex or the Hurricane Rana or whatever, and Barr would finish him with the frog splash.
That's so cool. That is so cool. I had no idea that was a tribute to Barr.
Yes. And the saddest part is people do it for Eddie now.
Right.
Now people get up and shake their shoulders and do it for Eddie. Dude, this world.
Yes.
So his first big program would then be with Malenko. The two won the Feud of the Year in the Observer Awards in 1995, as John had said earlier. So dude, check this out, okay? Heyman's actual long-term booking plan was for Chris Benoit to win the ECW title in late 95, and then they would do Eddie versus Benoit for the belt as the main event of ECW's first pay-per-view show. However, by the end of 95, Benoit, Guerrero, and Malenko all went to WCW. This also delayed ECW's first pay-per-view by a year. And the reason that Eddie wrestled Benoit on the initial one-night stand in 2005 is because Heyman finally had a chance to book his first pay-per-view main event on a pay-per-view card.
Literally, as you said that, I got goosebumps. Could you imagine ECW's launch if it would have been Benoit versus Eddie? Like, it was Taz versus Sabu, which is still good, but imagine Taz and Sabu as not just the main event, but like a co-main
on the card.
Event.
Yeah, just on the card.
Oh my word! I feel like my head just blew off my body.
And that's it. Heyman was adamant that match be on the first one night stand, because he never got a chance to book it and he wanted to book it now.
And we say all of these things about how bad things ended with Heyman and ECW, but he is a good guy.
Well, he is a terrible businessman.
Great
and
guy.
An awesome creative mind, freaking genius. And we're going to get to that in a minute. So we're now in WCW. And even though Eddie left ECW, Heyman's influence doesn't go away just yet. So according to Dave Meltzer, in April 1996, WCW was trying to make a working relationship with ECW. Kevin Sullivan's the booker at the time. He's talking with Heyman, and Heyman's trying to elevate Benoit and Guerrero. John, would you please take us through what Heyman's idea was for a program to do so?
So Heyman's idea was the Giant was champion. The suggestion Heyman gave was to defend against Benoit. In the match, Giant would pick up Benoit for the chokeslam, but Benoit would reverse it in the air into a crossface in the middle. This would have been a shocker submission for the time, and this finish actually did happen years later on an episode of Raw. Benoit would then lose the title to Guerrero in a match where Eddie was injured from the crossface, leaving him a wounded bird. The Giant would then take advantage of the injured Eddie and beat him for the title. Because Benoit never lost to the Giant and was the reason Eddie lost to the Giant, this would have set up the program for three-way matches. And that's really creative booking.
And in 1996 or 7 or whatever, that's nuts, man.
Mm-hmm.
Like that is incredible. And the vision to know with those two guys, because those two guys end up being legit world champions a couple of years later. You know, that's wild. So this obviously never happens. And Dave said that Kevin Sullivan wasn't really into it. And Bischoff thought that the two guys were great workers, but not main eventers. And even though he was making the most money that he ever had up to that point, Eddie was miserable most of the time in WCW. It said that he was his most happy in the ring, but his mental state outside of it was really starting to spiral. Things got worse when WCW ended its working agreement with New Japan, which was actually like an outlet for he, Malenko, and Benoit to escape the politics of WCW. Mm-hmm. Go out there, go on a tour, be treated with respect, have these awesome matches, and then come on back. So Conan and Jericho were both quoted about their time in WCW. Conan spoke about staying out until 4 or 5 a.m., drinking, doing pills. And Jericho spoke about the guys using GHB. So, you know, now we're starting to get into more of the substance abuse kind of deal. Eddie then became obsessive about his physique as he figured it was the only thing that was holding him back. It couldn't have been his ring work. So in 1997, he's on a diet where he eats 0 carbs, 0 fat. He would eat plain salads for dinner. And if he got hungry, he'd order another one. So literally just living on protein right now. He's on the gas as well. And then with his workouts added to his ring work, which were these high intensity, fast paced cruiserweight matches, he got shredded, which leads us to that physique taking on Rey Mysterio Jr. John, take us to our next match highlight.
Yes, the highlight here is Halloween Havoc 97. It's Eddie versus Rey. And if you're a wrestling fan and you've never seen this match, you're doing yourself a disservice because it's one of the greatest matches of all time. It's one that you turn on today and it literally translates to what you're seeing today. Eddie and Rey hook up in a classic for the Cruiserweight Championship. They start hot and fast early. Eddie asserted his strength on the outside, launching Rey into the ring steps. Rey used his acrobatics to maneuver around Eddie, but he was able to catch Rey into a back suplex. Eddie kept trying to rip Rey's mask off. The springboard backflip DDT by Rey off the top rope looked amazing. Eddie continued to rip the mask off, and Rey and Eddie's trust in each other really showed through here. And the power bomb into the pin by Eddie looked incredible. Just spot after spot after spot. The finish was Eddie trying to give Rey a razor's edge off the top rope, looking like the move he hit on Liger. And listeners, again, if this is the BT bomb, please let us know in the comments. But Rey rolled over Eddie into a sunset flip, and Rey rolled up Eddie for the win. This 14 minutes of ultimate cruiserweight action, and it's literally what shaped the style of wrestling that you see today.
And the crazy thing is the bumps that Rey's taking into the steps right away, like you'd said, all this stuff into the barricade, all of that. This fella is working still 27 years later.
Still working.
Absolute insanity, man. This match was glorious. What a rewatch. Also, if you watch that match after listening to this show, you will hear Tenay sprinkle in all of Eddie's backstory. He talks Black Tiger. He talks Mascara Mahika. Tenay is an encyclopedia, dude. You should rewatch it now that we've gone through that stuff. It's excellent.
Yes. And the match actually has a crazy story too. It's mask versus title, and Eddie was supposed to go over. And many people in the back didn't want Ray to lose this match, but Bischoff wasn't budging, which led to an incredibly tense scene backstage. Literally just before the show went on the air, Bischoff changed his mind and Ray went over. This is why Eddie regained the title a few weeks later on Nitro. And I had no idea about that.
Yep. And we all know the story that Bischoff wanted that mask off of him.
He did.
And that was supposed to be the time.
Oh.
And
so that's why he was ripping it like that.
Yeah, and the idea of him ripping it was because it was the mask match, but Bischoff wanted that to be the mask where Mysterio lost it. And they were able to kick the can down the road for a little bit.
Okay. Kicked it down a couple of years later.
Yep. So things really started to come to the surface on February 9th, 1998's edition of Nitro in El Paso. So Eddie and Jericho were booked to beat Malenko and Chavo. Eddie confronts Bischoff about his ceiling on the card and basically just asks for his release. And this is the famous backstage story where Bischoff throws the coffee onto him. So this led to a lot of heat on Bischoff, especially from the Latino wrestlers, because it's not like Eddie didn't have ground to stand on and where it happened, when it happened. And the crazy thing with this is Dave basically said something about like some pretty shady people that were friends with these Mexican wrestlers backstage as well. Like they were ready to take Bischoff out.
Oh, wow.
So Eddie actually diffused the whole situation. And later on, Bischoff did apologize for it. And then Eddie would downplay it later on. But things were hot in the kitchen that night. So regarding that tag team, Jericho actually said that he and Eddie were, quote, the greatest tag team that never was, end quote. And Meltzer said that they would have been the perfect recreation of Los Gringos Locos, as Eddie's only weakness was his promos at the time, and Jericho was a master on the mic. Jericho would have been Love Machine.
Yeah. Oh, that would have been great. Wow.
Like,
that would have been amazing.
And Jericho actually said that one of his biggest career regrets was never getting a real run with Eddie as a tag, because he felt that they had the potential to be as good as or better than the Hollywood Blondes. And tragically, that was also snuffed out way too soon by management. That was two crazy, crazy tag teams with four incredible workers that we got glimpses of and never a true run.
Man.
So that leads us to the accident, John. Would you please take us into that incident?
Yes, we jump ahead to New Year's Eve, 1998. Eddie was high on GHB, which we talked about GHB with the Rick Rude episode. He fell asleep at the wheel. His car was going 130 miles an hour. He was thrown out when the car crashed. He suffered a broken hip socket, punctured liver, severe back injuries, and his family was told he had about 48 hours to live. When it became clear that he was going to survive, his family was told he would never walk again. He was in the middle of negotiations with WCW when it happened, and his contract was expiring in early 1999. During the entirety of his absence, Bischoff paid him his full salary. Because of this, he later said that if Bischoff was still running the company in 2000, he would have never left. He came back too soon, and the bumps hurt way worse. This led Eddie to getting heavy into pain pills, and he actually overdosed twice, once in October and the other time in front of his entire extended family on Christmas Day. His family was furious with this, as his children and their children had to see his body as a shade of blue with barely a pulse being rushed to the hospital.
Crazy,
I can't imagine seeing that on Christmas Day.
No. And here's the other thing. In terms of wrestling, I don't think the highest of Eric Bischoff, but I give Eric Bischoff, the man, a lot of credit here. Because as many underhanded, horrible things that they did to some of these guys, like Davey Boy, we just went through the Davey Boy stuff.
Right.
He did right by Eddie. And I'm assuming that was probably born of the wanting a true make good for what he had done to him in that backstage incident.
Yeah.
But he held to it, man. And there is there is a tip of the cap to be given to Bischoff here. So as time went on, WCW is now falling apart. Because Brett is out, Jeff Jarrett's actually supposed to get the belt. He is actually out from a concussion given to him from a top of the cage splash from a 56-year-old Jimmy Snuka. Russo books a battle royal that Tank Abbott is supposed to win and become champ. You couple all of that with Ed Ferreira winning the Cruiserweight title, and the decision was made to replace Russo with Kevin Sullivan as the booker. This led to Benoit wanting out, and because he, Malenko, and Guerrero had a pact to stay together, even after Sullivan put the world title on Benoit, all three asked for and were granted their release.
So to be clear, Benoit was given his release while still being the WCW champion?
Yes. Yes. So they didn't even ask him to drop it on the way out.
Oh my
and
word.
If you want to know how much value the WCW championship had at that point in time, that'll tell you. They didn't even want him to do right by the business, which I'm sure he would have done. He wanted out of there.
Right. Yeah.
Yep. So they just plump gave him his release, vacated the title.
Oh my word.
The crazy thing is that Conan and Shane Douglas were also supposed to go as well, and the WWF didn't want them. So then they had to sort of go back groveling to WCW, and they paid for it later financially, man. Their contracts were not the same after that.
The Max Moon heat.
Mm-hmm. So the debut of the Radicals, which was Eddie, Benoit, Malenko, and Saturn, led to one of the biggest TV ratings of the year. But in his second WWF match, he blew out his elbow on a frog splash. Just after he came back, he blew out his hamstring in a match with Jericho, taking a monkey flip.
The monkey flip doesn't look like that. I mean, I can see why he has to launch himself, but I can't. That frog splash where he blows his elbow out is one of the most disgusting things you'll ever see. I
have never seen it, nor will I ever see it.
Yeah,
I don't do injuries like that, man.
Every time you see him doing a frog splash after that, you think, oh my gosh, that elbow.
If you think how many monkey flips he had done in his freaking life, man, and he pops a hamstring too. That's the worst part about it. Even though he's plagued by injuries, he's now starting to really find himself on the microphone, which was his one real weakness. So he created the Latino Heat persona, and he started his television relationship with China. So now he's building some star power, some charisma, all of that. However, his drug issues started to really become out of control, and his marriage is falling apart. And this only exacerbated his already diagnosed depression. So Malenko and Benoit go to Jim Ross to get him help. He was finally sent to rehab after he passed out in the locker room in a spring 2001 show in Minneapolis. He was there for 2 months, and while he was there, his wife asked him for a divorce and took his 2 daughters. His money was mismanaged to the point that he's now nearly broke. He leaves rehab. He gets sent to Les Thatcher's Heartland Wrestling in Cincinnati to get back into ring shape. 1 week after a friend of Eddie's who was working at HWA told Les that he was very concerned after Eddie told him about losing his wife and kids, Eddie crashed his car at Dean Malenko's condo complex in Florida and was fired by the WWF. And this was just before he was supposed to go back onto the road, but because he was under the influence at the time of the crash, there was really no other decision than to fire him. So Eddie's road to redemption actually came through religion. So he began a road to recovery. He started working independence. He goes back to New Japan for a stint in 2002. And Dave said that out of every wrestler that said that their addiction issues were behind them, he felt the most honest were always Eddie and William Regal, as they both admitted that it was a daily battle. It was never truly beaten. They were upfront with it, acknowledged it. It was never a "this is in my past" kind of deal, which, hats off to them for that.
Mm-hmm.
So Eddie stops drinking in October 2001, and he's now tearing up the indie scene. By March, WWE is seriously considering bringing him back. And John, now that we're on the road to redemption with Eddie, would you please give us your first WWE match highlight? But before you do, please let me note, we will not be covering the Brock match or the 2 JBL matches.
Yes.
We've covered them both in depth on the Mania 20 show and the Great American Bash show. Go back and check those out.
Yes, please go back and check those out in the archives. And it's really interesting that you mentioned all of that about him tearing up the scene and WWE seriously considering bringing him back, because Bruce talked about that on their show saying like we really wanted to bring him back, but it was one of those things he had to earn it and kind of prove it to us that he wasn't going to do it again.
And every time those guys do, they always come back better, man. Think about like Drew McIntyre.
Yep.
And, totally like not for the same reasons,
No.
but he had to go out and show it. Cody Rhodes.
Yeah. Go out and prove it. And they come back and they're the stars that they wanted them to be from the beginning.
Yep.
But back to our match highlight here. The Eddie versus John Cena parking lot brawl from SmackDown 2003. This is everything. And it's literally everything right now because it's part of a 4-pack that you can get at Target. That the Cena and the Eddie, that gear, you can find it in Targets today. And I just remember this match on SmackDown when it happened. And I remember I was absolutely glued. Cena was on his rise to the top. And Eddie here, he was on his ascension as well. It's really cool. They really parallel, but Guerrero being a more of a veteran leapfrogged him. And they were just, SmackDown was killing it week in and week out here. And I remember I wanted Cena to win this match so badly. And Cena had one of his memorable promo raps before the match even started. Eddie rolled up to the match in a low rider truck. And this is where they have all the trucks surrounding. They create, quote unquote, a ring in the parking lot area with the vehicles. And they literally use every single car. This is what's so amazing. Cena gave Eddie a suplex on the roof of the car. And while the lumberjacks around the car stood and watched, Cena pulled out every gimmick imaginable. He pulled out a lawnmower. He pulled out a shovel. He almost decapitated Eddie with the shovel. They're using car doors and seat belts, and all of it made sense. It was unbelievable. And Eddie's head went through a car window. Eddie used the cigarette lighter in the car on Cena's chest, wheeled Cena onto the hood of the car, and Chavito comes out of nowhere and hits Cena over the head. Eddie was on the roof of the adjacent car, hits the frog splash on the hood of the car for the win. And this match literally became a match type in the video game the very next year on WWE SmackDown versus Raw for PlayStation 2. This match was so good that it became a match type for years to come in the video game.
When you first had this when you first sent this over to me as being one of your matches, I didn't recall it. And the second I saw the cars, I was like, oh man, like it brought it all back, man. This is awesome. This is a great deep cut for you too, to find this one on a SmackDown for the people out there. Check this one out. So Eddie receives a vote of confidence. He wins the IC title from RVD on April 21st, 2002. So he's returning to his peak 97-98 form in the ring, and he's now on the verge of the biggest break of his career. Mm-hmm. Steve Austin goes to management and asks to work a program with him.
What?
Yes.
I cannot imagine what a Steve Austin Eddie Guerrero feud would have looked like.
My God, man. Unfortunately, this coincided with Austin's creative issues with management. Austin walks out and nothing was ever able to happen.
Man, there's so many what ifs in the wrestling business, and I feel like this is another one added onto that list.
This is a huge one.
A huge one.
To see brawling Austin versus technical mastermind Eddie. And here's why this would have worked, is because look at what Brett and Austin did.
Yes, that's exactly, yes.
So there was a saving grace, though, because he was drafted to SmackDown and he became part of the SmackDown 6.
I love the SmackDown 6, man.
Oh, forever, dude. So he's there with the SmackDown 6. If you don't know, is Angle, Eddie, Benoit, Edge, Rey Mysterio, and Chavito. So Eddie and Chavo started working together on house shows as a tag team, literally to give good matches on house shows. Yeah. That was the only reason. They threw them together, said, guys, go out there and have a good match. They started to get so much buzz that the 3-team tag team title program was created between the Los Guerreros, Angle and Benoit, and then Mysterio and Edge.
Oh, my word.
Yes. So it was all because they just sort of needed good house show filler.
And I think that this is a really good point to add on, that Heyman was running SmackDown when the SmackDown 6. Like, it's literally Heyman's chance to book everyone that he wanted to book in ECW.
You're absolutely right. Yes. And he was at the top of his creative powers here. I remember they created those SmackDown tag titles and I was like, oh, whatever. And then those matches, man.
Amazing.
Incredible stuff. Absolutely incredible stuff. So the Los Guerreros are now really starting to shine. They create the lie, cheat, and steal vignettes. It only gives them more confidence. It lets them show more charisma. And then they even added the lowrider to the ring entrance. And once they did that, dude, Eddie's now a full-blown superstar.
Oh, for sure.
So he's truly someone now that got his shot because of fan reaction. In Toronto, which you know those Toronto fans, right? Eddie's heavily cheered as a heel. But proving this wasn't just a Toronto thing, it continued on. And Eddie's heel turn made him the biggest babyface that he had ever been. He was a huge draw in LA, Dallas, San Fran, Houston, even Chicago. And his matches would routinely add several 100,000 viewers. So they tried to turn him, man, and his whole thing was lie, cheat, and steal. And he was so good at doing all of those things that everybody fell in love with him. Yeah, everybody just fell in love with him.
Yep.
So talks now are beginning backstage in 2003 about putting the rocket ship on him. So they do a tour of the Southwest, and when they look and see the crowds that are being drawn for SmackDown, they're now beating Raw in terms of the crowd sizes. People are starting to use the phrase, quote, he has the potential to be the Latino Steve Austin, end quote. Things are also starting to turn around for him personally. He reconciles with Vicky, and even though they never officially divorced, they have a second wedding in 2003. So it's now decided that we're going to go with Eddie, and he's going to take Brock's place as the man that SmackDown's built around.
Mm-hmm.
Title change happens. It's booked on February 15th, 2004's Cow Palace show in the archives. Check that out.
Archive it, baby.
This was the building that his brothers starred in the 70s, and it was 50 years since a Guerrero challenged for the world title. So Gory wrestled Lou Thez at Arena Mexico for the heavyweight championship in 1954.
Wow.
Yep. So the crowd is sold out, does an all-time record gate of 450,000, but it's not a huge pay-per-view success at this. So they thought it does 265,000 buys, and seeing what happens to those pay-per-view numbers, which continue to go down, that ended up being a fairly decent buy rate.
Know more about that. We talk about all of that stuff in our 2004 show. So there is a 2004 playlist here on the Podski, and you can check that out in the playlist section of the channel, and you can chronicle kind of what we're talking about here from WrestleMania 20 the whole way, kind of what's happening with Eddie. And we chronicle all of that in there. Yep.
The day before the match, Mondo and Eddie worked out, and the two had an argument about how heavy Eddie was lifting the day before the biggest match of his career, Mondo being really old school. That night, Eddie asks his brother to give him a pep talk to ready him for the big match. They spend the night in the hotel. Mondo and his mother were at the show. They celebrate with him. It's one of the iconic shots of Eddie jumping into the crowd holding the belt. After the match, however, Mondo makes a sarcastic remark that angers Eddie. The two go off on each other. And when it's over, not only did Mondo not room with Eddie again that night, the two didn't speak for almost a year.
Oh, my word.
Huge blow up. So his second most memorable WWE match, and maybe of his career, came when he co-main evented WrestleMania 20 on March 14th, 2004 in MSG. John, our next match highlight.
Yes, and this is a match that we've already talked about previously in the WrestleMania 20 show, so the link is in the description below. Please go check that out because we have a lot of good Eddie content sprinkled out throughout all of that show. It's a really fun show. We also do the build to WrestleMania as another bonus show as well. That was the first unlockable that you all got. We've gone into that show in detail, but the thing that's most memorable about that match that we talked about too is it's the boot. It's one of the most clever and creative finishes that is tailor-made for Eddie and the gimmick. Lie, cheat, and steal. He literally stole that championship from Kurt in the match. It's just so good. It's the highlight of Eddie's run on the main roster. Him becoming champion at No Way Out and beating Lesnar was so out of WWE's way at the time. And now we know it's because Brock was leaving the company, but it was such a big deal that they chose Eddie as the guy. And like literally this match, the WrestleMania 20 match, is part of the 2K24 40 years of WrestleMania that you can play like this year. Like it still means something today. And it's just a core memory of my fandom. And if you haven't seen this match, truly go back and see it. And if you haven't watched it in a long time, even more reason to go back and watch, because it's just so good.
Yeah. And like you said, he's the king of creative spots like that. The one thing that I have to say that really stood out to me was when he doesn't have the boot on anymore and he has just the no-show socks on.
Yes.
Dude, my ankles would have been raw. The back of my feet would have been raw.
That is something we never talked about before, is the fact that Eddie was wearing ankle socks with his tights. How do you do that?
Incredible, dude. He was a master worker, I guess. I don't know. So Meltzer said that even though the two had their differences, including an actual backstage physical altercation between them, Eddie always praised Angle as being perhaps the most physically talented man that he was ever in the ring with. After Eddie retained the title 45 minutes later, after Chris Benoit made Triple H tap in the main event, Guerrero was sent out to congratulate Benoit as confetti fell from the ceiling. The two, always too small to main event, friends were the champions in the biggest wrestling company's biggest show ever. That show grossed more money than any WrestleMania history and had the second largest number of buys in pay-per-view history.
That memory, it just shows that like those two guys, they started together in New Japan and they ended together in WWE, and they made it to the pinnacle of the biggest company in the world at a time where it was the land of the giants. It was like it was a legit changing of the guard.
Yep. And who better to share the moment with? And that was an awesome scene. So after all the highs of winning the world title, co-main event in WrestleMania, things started to go south quick. We actually covered this more in depth in the Mania 20 and Great American Bash shows, the Great American Bash show especially. Angle's out with another neck injury. Brock gives his notice. SmackDown is now devoid of major heels, and this is where JBL is elevated to be Eddie's first major foil. Layfield actually said that Eddie always backed him in this, and he credited Guerrero for giving him the program that made his career and led him to the most successful run that he'd ever had. As we covered on this show and in many other places anywhere beyond the Southwest. But the crazy thing is, the first match between Eddie and Layfield did 235,000 buys. This number made the company panic, but those numbers actually only went down after they took the belt off of Eddie.
That's just wrong place, wrong time for Eddie. It's not Eddie's fault that the company was floundering. They just were literally losing so many fans because of the post-Attitude Era. We talk about this in the Great American Bash show because we give you week-to-week breakdowns of everything. And because you can see from the house show reports and the injury notes that Eddie really started to crater in late April into late June, especially when he snapped in that Germany show, took all of that personally. And it wasn't his fault that the company was cratering. He literally took the company cratering as his fault, and it wasn't his fault at all.
Yeah, it's a really tragic thing, man. So as John noted, his body's really starting to betray him here. It's initially thought that it was because of the blood loss in the JBL match, but in reality, it was 17 years of high-level in-ring work, the car crash that should have killed him. All these things are now really starting to catch up to him. He saw a doctor for his back problems, and the doctor told him that the damage that he had was comparable to somebody in their 70s or 80s, and he was given the advice to retire immediately.
You reading that for the first time? I've never heard that before. I can't imagine what that feels like to be walking around with a 70 to 80-year-old back and you're in your 30s.
Right. And
that literally checks out with all of those reports that they were talking about with the Great American Bash, where they kept saying that Eddie is just in bad shape. And it's literally because what you said, Mongoose, his body is betraying him here. And it's like he thinks that he's failing when it's just that he's not doing anything wrong. It's just his body's literally screaming for help because you've been doing this for so long.
That was excellent, man. So he basically told the doctor that he's in the middle of the biggest run of his career and retirement's out of the question. He was digging himself out of the financial problems that he was in, we noted previously, and now He has a wife and he has 3 kids to provide for. Not to mention, wrestling's the only thing he ever did. So he was scared about what life outside of wrestling would look like. Meltzer even wrote about his recollection of writing about how banged up Eddie was at the time and that it was far worse than anybody realized. Eddie was told that he would get a lighter schedule, and although there were some weeks off, it didn't last. Through it all, he was there for other guys backstage, including JBL when he's going through his divorce, and then Batista, who then starts to feel this same kind of, quote, top guy pressure that cracked Eddie. The crazy thing is, man, he was there for these guys. He provided a shoulder for them to lean on, and they had the spot that he wanted and that he never deserved to lose.
Yeah. Oh my word. I think that just shows how good of a person that Eddie was post all of his addiction issues, like him coming back and being more understanding, but it just feels like he couldn't do it for himself.
Yeah. Yeah. And everything that I read said that he was 1,000% authentic. And especially like with the religion deal is that he was never one to push things onto people, but he was a true believer. And, that's blessed to anybody that can do that, man, because it's being there for other people's, especially in a business that's so selfish, is a really cool thing.
Yes.
So back to our timeline. Fearing for Eddie's physical and mental stability, the company decided to put the title on JBL at the Great American Bash Show in June 2004. Unlike the LA show the month before, though, this show only drew about 5,500 paid. Dave said, in hindsight, Eddie believed that the company made the right decision, though, taking the title off of him. John, Chris Jericho actually was quoted regarding his thoughts about this. Would you please read us what those thoughts were?
Yes. Jericho said, and quote, "When Eddie was champ, business was down. The truth is, and we all know it, that business was going to be down no matter who was the champ at the time. But he looked at the numbers and he took them personally. That's when the vultures, and you know who they are, came down on him. Or they sensed weakness. Some wanted his spot. Oh, he's crazy. Eddie's too eccentric. Sure, when he's on, he's as great as anyone, but he's inconsistent. What about when he's not on? The truth is, even when he wasn't on, he was still better than most of the people in the company at their best," end quote.
So Eddie started to work programs with Angle and some underneath guys like Luther Reigns and Mark Jindrak.
Yeah.
A storyline gets developed for he and Ray to start teaming together, break up, and then wrestle each other at Mania 21. His chiropractor told him that he didn't even know how he could walk anymore. And not only was Eddie walking, he's performing, he's hitting the frog splash every night and so on. He wants the title back now to prove that he learned from his first run and that he can handle the pressure. In the meantime, Mondo and Eddie reconcile, and Eddie used him as someone to sound off on about the backstage politics in the WWE. His final championship was the tag title, which he won with Mysterio in February 2005 at the No Way Out pay-per-view, 1 year after he won the big one versus Brock. They would tease problems between the two, and Eddie's actual turn was delayed until after WrestleMania. The story being told was that every time the two would wrestle out of, respect and gentlemen's agreements, that Mysterio would always win. And finally, Eddie would snap. And that happened at MSG in April 2005. So this story was actually largely put together by Eddie and Ray, and they based it on Eddie's actual emotions, which is why people thought that it was the best character work of his career. They brought in the real life storyline of when Eddie was separated from Vicky, he fathered a child with another woman.
Oh.
This was not Dominic, though. That was a real happening. Yep. They used Dominic to play the role. Because Eddie couldn't beat Ray in the ring, he was going to destroy him mentally by taking his family. However, Eddie's physical state was still in decline, and as a result, the matches between the two were good, but not always to the level that they'd been at in previous years. While the angle was controversial, Eddie and Ray nailed it. And even though Eddie was as rotten as a heel as can be, he was so good at it that he would get cheered. Mm-hmm. The segments were a huge success. Several of them added over 1 million viewers over a 15-minute period.
That's
so
crazy.
This thing was fire. So John, take us through the blow-off.
Yes, this blow-off is at SummerSlam 2005. It's the Eddie versus Ray ladder match, custody for Dominic Mysterio match. And I really wanted to talk about this match because we're going to talk about SummerSlam '05 at some point here on the show, probably next year, but it's literally playing out in real time today. Literally, Rhea Ripley and Liv Morgan are fighting for Dom, and everyone is clamoring for the same match that they've seen just with these two women now. And if you haven't seen this match, you absolutely have to see it. If you haven't seen it in a long time, you got to go back and watch it. Please let us know in the comments what you think about this match. But I personally feel that this is the best match that these two ever had. It deserves 7 stars. They start the match really quick, and Eddie climbs to the ladder early, and Ray springboards off the apron and kicks Eddie off the ladder. Ray hit another seated springboard senton to Eddie on the outside. They race up the ladder, and they brawl at the top. Eddie went for the sunset flip, but he slipped off of Eddie, and that one looked a little bit bad, but they kind of come back to it later on. Eddie sandwiched Ray between 2 ladders and gave Ray a helo from the apron. The way that they kept showing Dominic sitting in the front row was so good, especially with the social workers. The way that the way that these guys used the ladder, it almost made me feel like they did it better than Shawn and Razor did, because it felt like they actually had the match with the ladders. The second sunset flip, thought that Ray had broken his leg. Eddie goes up the ladder, but Dom runs in and he tries to shake the ladder and try to get Eddie to fall. Eddie with the finger wag was just incredible. He gets down and says, quote, "You're going to love me." And he goes to slap Dom. And when he pulls his hand back, Ray grabs his hand. Ray hits the 619 on Eddie. He climbs the ladder. Eddie rushes back up the ladder, puts Ray in the electric chair. And at the top of the ladder, Ray reverses it into a sunset flip. Ray climbs again. Eddie pushes the ladder out. Ray is hanging from the briefcase. He falls. Eddie catches and power bombs him. Eddie pins Ray with the ladders, and Eddie goes to the top. The ladder falls out. Ray pulls him down, and this was an ugly fall. You were watching this, you think that Eddie legitimately hurt himself. Eddie gets back to the top of the ladder, but Vicky runs in, and she pushes the ladder, and Eddie falls. Ray then gets back up, climbs to the top, grabs the briefcase, and he wins back custody of Dominic Mysterio.
It was such an incredible match for such a, oh my gosh, this storyline. You know, It really was. And I'm glad that you noted the Ray fall, because I thought that his leg snapped in half. I thought that Eddie broke his leg or tore something. Yes. And even Ray hanging from the carabiner at the end after he won, I thought he blew his knee out whenever he fell off, whenever he came off the ladder at the end. This was crazy, man. And it was an excellent match. It was absolutely excellent. So Eddie's final program is with Batista, and he's now challenging him for the title. The elevation into the scene didn't actually make much sense, being that he was coming off of so many losses, especially being a heel that couldn't beat Little Ray, challenging a guy that's a foot taller and 75 pounds heavier than him.
Yeah.
Eddie's heel run post Ray was difficult because people didn't want to pay to boo him. Mm-hmm. There's some Austin effect here. And so it started to hurt business, started to hurt box office because they didn't want bad guy Eddie. The feud was also booked with comedy, Eddie trying to outsmart Batista, but because Eddie was the heel here, quote unquote, they wanted to protect Batista, and so the tricks would always backfire.
Yeah, and I noticed that a lot with like the chair, which is the opposite of how Eddie had been booked for years. He was always the smartest guy in the room. And like with the belt spot where he would literally lay down, and the finish with Kurt Angle at WrestleMania 20, it always worked for him. And then it just now all of a sudden didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. That belt spot, dude, they still do it today.
Yep.
Hit it, throw it to the other guy, lay down, they've done that forever, man. Dave said the idea was for everyone to know that he was a heel, trying to fool people into thinking he was a baby face. As you said, with the chair thing and everything else, it seemed a little disjointed at times. Would you please give us the match review of Eddie's last pay-per-view, which actually occurred on his 38th birthday?
I didn't know that was actually his birthday. And I had not saw this match until I was doing the research here to watch what matches, and I was blown away. And this is where I was in my phase out of wrestling. And I wasn't watching, but I was like still playing the video games. And this match happened about a month before his unexpected death. So this final pay-per-view match is great. And I really wanted to highlight it here. It's really the clash of styles that you really didn't see Eddie have since his title win versus Brock Lesnar. And Eddie found the new addiction, and his addiction was respect. He wanted to be Batista's friend, but Batista figured out that it was all just to distract Batista to get the title. The crowd was melting for them, and they started out with a test of strength, and nothing makes me feel more warm and fuzzy than test of strength.
Yeah.
My heart was warm and my belly was full watching that. Batista used his power to control Eddie, so Eddie resorted to his lying, cheating, and stealing by distracting Batista and grabbing the chair. Batista fell for Eddie's bait as he was choked on the top rope, and then Eddie would hit a frog splash on Batista's back, but Batista was able to kick out. Eddie would continue to target Batista's back throughout the match, and it would make it harder for Batista to use the Batista bomb. Eddie fell onto the ref and knocked him out, and Eddie would grab the chair, but he couldn't bring himself to use it. Eddie hits the three amigos, goes for the frog splash, but Batista rolled out of the way on the frog splash. He hits Eddie with the spine buster, and he retained the World Heavyweight Championship.
So the original idea for the post-match was for Eddie to turn on Batista on the TV after the pay-per-view and set up a rematch for Survivor Series. But because of how that match went, especially when the crowd cheered when Eddie put the chair down, they realized that it wasn't going to work. So they had to call it off because the crowd was just going to cheer and they were going to kill Batista dead.
Yep.
So Eddie goes to the doctor either the day before or the day of his last fight to a pro wrestling show. He was exhausted. He was flying to Minneapolis and then taking a red eye after the show to Italy for an 8-day European tour. All of this while his back is sand. You know,
I can't imagine like you're in that much pain and you're going to hop on a plane.
He's not in the best of health. He's not sleeping. And so he got a prescription for pain medication. Chavo and Eddie actually ended up on the same flight. Eddie moved from first class to coach to hang out with him. Chavo was unhappy. Eddie coached him on how to approach Vince about it. They watched a movie together on the flight, and then they made plans to wake up and train the next morning before TV. Unfortunately, that never happened. They broke into his room just after 7 a.m. on November 20th, 2005. Eddie was clinging to life in the bathroom. He had a heart attack while brushing his teeth. He passed away very quickly after they had called for an ambulance. He died of heart failure, which is almost assuredly the result of a combination of prescription drugs, steroids, recreational drugs, heavy drinking, and his recent HGH use. There was a list of prescription drugs found in his room at the time of his death, but the official cause of death was heart failure. So, John, close the chapter on Eddie Guerrero for us, brother.
Yes, Eddie's funeral was held in Phoenix, Arizona. Benoit, Jericho, JBL, Dean Malenko all spoke. Tom Pritchard, who bonded with Eddie when they were in rehab together, read a statement by Jim Ross, who he couldn't travel due to his colon surgery. Ross's statement said that in 33 years in the business, Eddie was one of the best performers he'd ever seen. Vince then spoke, and Valerie Coleman read Vicky Guerrero's final goodbye. After the funeral, apart from everyone about 30 yards away, was Steve Austin. Austin doesn't go to funerals, but he flew to Phoenix anyway.
This was a lot of fun and very sad.
Yes, it was a lot of fun because I learned so much stuff about Eddie Guerrero that I literally never knew, and all while it being incredibly heartbreaking as well. So we thank you for listening. Please be sure to comment and subscribe below. Let us know what your favorite Eddie moment was. Let us know what your favorite match was from Eddie Guerrero. We're figure guys, so let us know what your favorite Eddie figure is too, because they're out there in the wild right now. So be sure to keep listening and subscribing. We will be bringing back the Scott Hall episode next month. That is one that you all unlocked. So keep listening and subscribing. We thank you for listening. And we got to thank Teddy Mongoose here because it wouldn't be possible without all of the note digging that he brings to the show here. So with that, we thank you all, and we will see you next time on the Podski.